After gaining independence from Spain in 1821, Mexico was in a chaotic state. The government and presidency were continuously changing hands, the economy was declining, and there were numerous rebellions. Then, in the 1830s, the Republic of Texas gained its independence from Mexico. However, the borders between the two nations were never agreed upon. Meanwhile, the Americans were aggressively pursuing their belief of manifest destiny. However, a treaty with the British stopped them from expanding north of Oregon, so they turned their attention south. In 1845, the Republic of Texas and its many American inhabitants happily agreed to join the Union, but the Mexicans turned down the United States' offer to buy Santa Fe de Nuevo Mexico, Alta California, and the disputed regions in Texas. American troops were then sent into the contested border regions, but a scouting party was attacked by Mexican troops, and that gave the Americans a reason to go to war. However, many American politicians still viewed it as an illegal invasion. They started the war by quickly driving the Mexicans across the Rio Grande and sending a fleet to attack port cities along California, which encouraged the already revolting Californians to fight for the Americans. The US forces were then divided into two. One, under the leadership of future President Zachary Taylor, went south and conquered Monterrey, while another headed west, easily taking Santa Fe and eventually Los Angeles at the start of 1847. Revolts in Mexico City halted a counterattack and allowed Zachary Taylor's army to seize Buena Vista. However, President Polk grew suspicious of Taylor's political ambitions, so sent another army to take Veracruz. This army had the likes of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, and Matthew Perry in its ranks. They moved from Veracruz to Mexico City, fighting off all the Mexican attempts to stop them, even though they were heavily outnumbered. They moved into Mexico City in September 1847. Santa Anna, the Mexican president, fled the city, and a peace treaty was signed in early 1848, surrendering all the Mexican land above the modern-day border to the United States, except for a small part of southern Arizona and New Mexico, but that was bought later in 1853. The newly acquired land was the new frontier in America, the Wild West. The regions became even more influential after the Californian gold rush in the 1850s. On the downside, however, the new territory created a lot of tension, as no one could agree whether slavery would be allowed in them or not. The Compromise of 1850 was a result of these disagreements, and the whole debate was one of the causes behind the US Civil War. In the late 19th century, the Spanish Empire was only a fraction of what it used to be. They held on to Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a couple footholds in Africa and a few Pacific islands like Guam. However, in Cuba there was growing demand for independence. The 1870s saw the Cubans fight the Spanish in the 10 Years' War, but the Spanish emerged victorious. Then, in 1895, violence erupted again and the Cuban War of Independence began. Meanwhile, the USA was the great power in the Western Hemisphere and wished to expand their influence. For decades, Americans wanted to take over Cuba. There were attempts to buy the island, and there had been a few attempts by filibusters to take the island militarily. Plus, the organizers of the revolution, like Jose Marti, were emigres living in the United States, so the US was pretty tied up to Cuba. Back in Cuba, the Spanish were rounding people into concentration camps where many would die of hunger and disease. The yellow press in America used this and a few fabricated claims to rouse the US population to demand war. The US government was also unhappy about the guerrilla warfare, as it was causing heavy losses to the large American investments on the island. In February 1898, a US battleship, which was sent to protect US interests on the island, sank in Havana Harbor. The sinking was probably an accident, however the press fabricated the story, so although war wasn't President McKinley's desired option, he was forced into action. With the support of the vast majority of Congress, the US Navy blockaded Cuban ports. In April 1898, war broke out, and it was clear that the US had the upper hand. US ships were dispatched to the Philippines and defeated the Spanish Navy in the Battle of Manila Bay. The Filipinos had, just 2 years earlier, rose up against the Spanish themselves. However, their revolution ended in failure and their leaders were forced into exile in Hong Kong. The United States transported these leaders back into the Philippines to lead the revolutionaries against the Spanish. These forces besieged Manila and declared the Philippines a republic. In June 1898, because of its now strategic position, the United States formally annexed Hawaii after they helped overthrow their monarchy a few years earlier, and they strengthened their position in the region by seizing Guam from the Spanish. Back in Cuba, American troops were able to take Guantanamo Bay, a naval base they would lease off the Cubans a few years later. and they landed near Santiago hoping to take the city. The Spanish were able to put up some resistance, however the American forces, which included Buffalo Soldiers and the Rough Riders, were able to defeat them at the Battle of San Juan Hill and El Caney in early July. The former battle was where Teddy Roosevelt earned his fame. Santiago eventually fell and the Americans continued to occupy the city for the rest of the war. They then turned their attention to Puerto Rico, and despite numerous battles, they could only capture the southern half of the island. But with the loss of their navy, the Spanish could not launch a counterattack, so signed for a truce on the 12th of August. In the Philippines, however, the Spanish and the American forces were unaware that the truce had been signed. Both sides resented the idea that Filipino revolutionaries would take the besieged capital, Manila. So they planned a mock battle, which allowed the US Army to take the city, while the Spanish peacefully withdrew. The peace deal gave Cuba its independence, however they were under America's sphere of influence. The Spanish Empire had in effect ceased to exist after they gave the United States Puerto Rico, Guam and the Philippines. However, the revolutionary element in the Philippines remained, so the Americans had to fight a longer and more costly war with the Filipinos to assert their control.
The history of American imperialism dates back as far as the Founding Fathers do, when Thomas Jefferson stated that he was waiting for the fall of the Spanish Empire until our population can be sufficiently advanced to gain it from them piece by piece. When Mexico successfully gained its independence, it wasn't long before the US found the American Southwest in its hands after a war with the new country. Nearly 50 years later, after the US successfully defeated Spain in 1898, Jefferson's prophecy would once again come into play. One of the results of the Spanish-American War was that several Spanish colonies fell into American hands. Two of these were Cuba and the Philippines, and while the US made it clear that it wouldn't keep Cuba, the story of the Philippines was a bit different. Hi everyone, Thought Monkey here, and today I'll be talking about the Philippine-American War. The Philippines is a nation made up of many islands. During the age of exploration in the 16th century, the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan arrived on the islands and claimed them for Spain. Over the next 400 years, the Filipino people were subjugated to the rule of Spain, which had some ups and a lot of downs. Even before the US went to war with Spain and took possession of the Philippines, Filipino revolutionaries had already been struggling for independence from the big, bad Spanish Empire. And while at first many of them believed that the Americans were coming to liberate them from Spanish rule, it was clear that when they didn't allow the general of the revolutionary forces, Emilio Aguinaldo, and his troops to march to Manila alongside American troops, that the US had other ideas in mind. In October of 1898, a conference was held to determine the fate of the Philippines. The Americans were given three choices: to hand the islands back to Spain, to give the Philippines its independence, or to annex the territory. While many anti-imperialist Americans were against annexation and quoted President Lincoln when he said, "No man is good enough to govern another man without the other's consent," the fact is that those in power held a different view of the Philippines. President William McKinley believed that it was God's will for Americans to uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and believed that they were unfit for self-government. And finally, he believed that it would leave a power vacuum of which Germany or other rival countries may be quick to fill. On February 6, 1899, the treaty to annex went before the US and passed by one vote. The Philippines now belonged to the Americans. While the treaty was passed in the US, the Filipino revolutionaries were not quite happy with the idea. Fighting quickly erupted, and by June 2, 1899, the First Philippine Republic officially declared war against the United States. The war lasted 3 years and the US found victory. The Philippines were devastated by the war as it caused a breakdown in its infrastructure, causing hunger, disease, and displacement. Ultimately, an estimated 34,000 to 220,000 Filipinos were either injured or killed. The Roman Catholic Church was de-established as a state church, and English became the primary language among the government, business, and education. While the official war was over, fighting between different revolutionary groups in the Philippines and American forces continued for more than 10 years. The issue was not necessarily that the US wasn't going to grant the Filipinos independence, but more about when and under what conditions. In July of 1902, the Philippine Organic Act stated that upon peace, a legislative government would be created containing a lower house which would be popularly elected by Filipinos and an upper house which would be appointed by the President of the United States. At home in the US, the public tended to consider the annexation of the Philippines as expensive and something that brought little profit. Moreover, Teddy Roosevelt said as early as 1901 that he wanted the Philippines to be able to self-govern, and by 1907 he said that he was ready to figure out a way to give the islands their independence. By 1916, the Jones Act was passed promising the eventual independence of the islands and created an elected Philippine Senate. And in the 1919 presidential election, Woodrow Wilson stated that his intention was to deprive ourselves of that frontier, the Philippines. In 1934, another act was signed promising Filipino independence in 10 years, but because of World War II, there was a 2-year delay, and the United States finally granted the Philippines independence in 1946. The question remains, however, did the US do the right thing when it annexed the Philippines over 100 years ago? If the Philippines hadn't been annexed, would they have been colonized by another global player? Who really knows? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to stay updated with the latest Thought Monkey video. Thank you.